Assalamu alaikum. A very good day, greetings. I hope and I pray that everything is fine with you and you are enjoying your semester through online lectures. I am not talking only of American history, but all of the courses. And one thing I would like to mention here that when we will have time, sometime, sure. So we can have like a group discussions or your question answers. So there is anything that I can do for you, it should be done. Because online becomes a little mechanical understanding of what I am saying and what you are listening. But there could be many questions which I will welcome always. In the last lecture, we talked about that Wilson wanted peace. And then there was a peace conference in Paris and Versailles Treaty. But the conference labored from January to May 1919 and finally brought forth the Versailles Treaty. American liberals' hopes were really very high, and they thought that this peace settlement failed to carry out the principle of self-determination completely. The victors in the war forced Germany to accept responsibility for having caused the war, an act of senseless vindictiveness as well as gross oversimplification, and to sign a blank check. Who does it? So the complaint of the critics were individually reasonable, yet their conclusions were not entirely fair. Although the Allies seized the German colonies, they were required under the mandate system to render the League of Nations annual accounts of their stewardships and to prepare the inhabitants for eventually independence. Eventually, Wilson was persuaded the powers to incorporate persuaded the European countries to powers to incorporate the League of Nations in the treaty. I should reframe this sentence that Wilson persuaded all allies in this war to incorporate the League of Nations. And Wilson expected League of Nations to make up for all inadequacies of Versailles Treaty. Once the League had begun to function, problems like freedom of the seas and disarmament would solve themselves, he argued. Liberal critics of the League were correct in saying that Wilson was seeking to prop up the existing social and economic system. He hoped, though unrealistically, as it turned out, to see Europe develop a capitalist work consensus like the one that existed in the United States. And when Wilson returned home from France, he finally directed his attention to the task of winning public approval of his handiwork. And that was the idea of the League of Nations. Wilson could count on Democratic senators almost to a man, but he had to win over many Republicans to obtain the two-thirds majority necessary for ratification. But Senate rejected the idea of this League of Nations. Dismayed but not crushed, friends of the League of Nations in both parties forced reconsideration of the treaty in early 1920s. And Senate balloted again in March. Half the Democrats voted for the treaty, and the other, mostly Southern Party leaders, joined the irreconcilables. Together they mustered 35 votes, 7 more than the 1/3 that met defeat. Leaving this political and military side aside, we have to see how the American society started facing demobilization. To win the war, nation had accepted dramatic and drastic regulation of the economy. When it ended, the Woodrow Wilson administration blithely assumed that the economy could readjust itself without direction. Sorry, it does not happen normally. The army was demobilized, pouring millions of veterans into the job market without plan. So, and all the attention was on the War Industries Board, and other agencies were dropped overnight. Billions of dollars worth of war contracts were cancelled. Inflation, in turn, produced labor trouble alarmingly. The unions, grown strong during the war, struck for wage increase. More than 4 million workers, 1 out of 5 in the labor force, were on a strike, and at some time during 1919. This was not a good news for the economy, and for mobilization both. We were talking in the last lecture about the First Great War, the World War I, and America gained a lot of benefits from it, being introduced into the whole world community as a power, especially the economic power. But the wars have their own cost also. So, to win the war, the nation had accepted drastic regulation of economy. Always in the times of war, in the times of pandemics, it is always the economy that suffers. When it ended, the Wilson administration assumed that the economy could readjust itself without direction. And that was too simplistic an outlook for building the economy. The army was demobilized, pouring millions of veterans into the job market without plan. Nearly all controls established by the War Industries Board and other agencies were dropped overnight, and billions of dollars worth of war contracts were cancelled. Business boomed in 1999. Economic boom has so far been an experience of an easy doom also. As consumers spent wartime savings on automobiles, homes, and other goods that had been in short supply during the war, but temporary shortage caused inflation. By 1920, the cost of living stood at more than twice the level of 1913. Inflation, in turn, produced labor trouble. The union, grown strong during the war, struck for wages increase. More than 4 million workers, 1 out of 5 in the labor force, were on strike at some time during 1919. Then came one of the most hardest economic decline in American history. Between July 1920 and March 22, prices, especially agriculture prices, plummeted upward, and the upward consequences were unemployment soared like anything. For more serious than the economic losses were the social effects of these difficulties. Most Americans found strikes frustrating and drew invidious comparison between the lot of the unemployed soldier who had risked his life for $1 a day and that of the striker who had drawn for fat wages during the war in perfect safety. So it was between peace and war. The activities of radicals in the labor movement led millions of citizens to associate unionism and strike with the new threat of communist world revolution. Although there were only a relative handful of communists in the United States, Russia's experience persuaded many people that a tiny minority of ruthless revolutionaries can take over a nation by revolution. Russia and millions of peoples could have joined it if the conditions were right. Organized labor in America had seldom been truly radical, but some labor leaders had been attracted to socialism, and many Americans failed to distinguish between the common ends sought by communists and socialists and the entirely different methods by which they proposed to achieve those ends. A general strike paralyzed America in 1919, February 1919 to be specific. In September 1919, a total of 343,000 steel workers walked off their jobs, and in the same month, the Boston police struck. Violence marked the street strike, and the suspension of police protection in Boston led to looting and fighting that ended only when Governor Coolidge called out the National Guards. During this same period, a handful of terrorists attempted to murder various prominent persons, including John Rockefeller, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., and Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. What particularly aroused the public was the fact that most radicals were most radicals were not the American citizens. Wartime fear of alien saboteurs easily transferred itself into peacetime terror of foreign radicals. Pakistan has suffered in one way or the other about these foreign radicals. In this muddled way, radicalism, unionism, and question of racial and national origins combined to make many Americans believe that their way of life was in imminent danger, and they called it Red Scare, and it was born out of these feelings. In August 1919, Palmer has established the General Intelligence Division within the Department of Justice, headed by Hoover, to collect information about clandestine radical activities. The public reacted so favorably that Palmer planned an immense roundup of communists. And in January 1920, his agents, reinforced by logical means, initiated a union with local police and self-appointed vigilantes, struck simultaneously in 33 cities. The public tolerated these wholesale violations of civil liberties because of the supposed menace of communism. Gradually, however, protests began to be heard. No revolutionary outbreak had taken place. Of 6,000 seized in Palmer raids, only 565 proved liable to deportation. Wilson still hoped for vindication at the polls in 1920 in the presidential elections, which he sought to make a great and solemn referendum on the League. He would have liked to run again himself, but in his enfeebled condition he attracted no support. माफ कीजिएगा. The Democrats nominated James M. Cox of Ohio. Cox favored joining the League, but the election did not very sorry. Don't get afraid. It's not corona, it's only my asthma. The Republicans, whose candidate was another Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding, shamelessly equivocated on the issue. The election turned on another matters largely emotional. Disillusioned by the results of the war, many Americans had had their fill of idealism. They wanted, apparently, to end the long period of moral uplift and reform agitation that had begun under Theodore Roosevelt and return to what Harding called normalcy. To the extent that the voters were expressing opinion on Wilson's League, they responded overwhelmingly in the negative. Harding had been a strong reservationist, yet he swept the country, winning over 161 million votes to Koch's 9.1 million votes. And in July 1921, Congress finally ended the war with the certain power by passing a joint resolution. The war on the war front was won over or taken care of, but the depression in American economy set in.